Ahmed Zakayev, head of the Cabinet of Ministers of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, was born in 1959 in Kazakhstan, where his family had been deported in 1944 as part of Stalin's Operation Lentil. After their rehabilitation, the family returned to their homeland in Chechnya. In 1994, he was invited by the first president of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Dzhokhar Dudayev, to head the Ministry of Culture. With the outbreak of the First Chechen War, he became a unit commander in the armed forces of Ichkeria. After the war ended, he served as foreign minister of Ichkeria and later became one of the closest allies of President Aslan Maskhadov. During the Second Chechen War, he was the government's representative abroad, taking part in international negotiations. Since January 2002, he has lived in the United Kingdom, where he was granted political asylum. Russia sought his extradition on charges of terrorism, but a London court rejected the request, ruling the case politically motivated.
I'm glad to welcome you to Kiev. Thank you for joining our program. I'd like to begin our conversation with Ichkeria. In July 1991, your republic declared independence. Let's recall those days and that time. What was the situation back then, and how did you and your people manage, even if for a while, to break away from this empire?
The dates are a little different. I mean, it was autumn. Our elections were in October, and the Declaration of State Sovereignty was adopted in November. But all this was happening during the so-called Gorbachev perestroika. To clarify, for those who might not remember, especially since Russian propaganda has done much to discredit our movement, our state, and our people, everything that happened at that time was done in full accordance with the laws of the USSR, the laws of the Russian Federation, and, of course, the principles and norms of international law. The principle of people's right to self-determination was relevant then, as it has always been in politics, particularly in the West, where it was taken very seriously. Throughout the Cold War, we were raised in this spirit. Foreign broadcasts, like Radio Liberty and other channels that were accessible then, spoke openly about the rights of colonized peoples of the Soviet Union to independence and statehood, urging them toward freedom. When Gorbachev decided to restructure the country, it was partly to divert attention from deeper problems, the economic crisis, and, after the defeat in Afghanistan, the clear reality that the USSR could not survive in its existing form. Perestroika was conceived as the solution. Interestingly, even when Andropov headed the KGB, he had sent students to the West to prepare for a market economy in the USSR. This shows that the transformation from USSR to CIS was not solely a Western victory. The Soviet leadership understood the system was unsustainable and decided to reformat it themselves. In April, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR passed laws equalizing the status of autonomous republics with union republics. This led to the Parade of Sovereignties. On November 26, the Supreme Soviet of the Chechen Ingush Republic adopted the Declaration of State Sovereignty, dropping the Soviet Socialist Autonomous Republic label and becoming a Union Republic. We took part in drafting the new Ogarevo Treaty, scheduled for signing on August 21st, but on August 19th the coup happened, orchestrated by the KGB, when they realized many regions might leave entirely. The Baltic states outright refused to sign. Georgia stated unequivocally they would not sign. Ukraine held a referendum, declaring it would be free and independent. Well, In this situation, the process still continued. Gorbachev continued his policy. The document for signing was being prepared, and, in fact, the Ukrainian delegation and the delegation of the Chechen Republic were already in Moscow on the 19th to sign this union treaty, but the State Committee on the State of Emergency happened, and from that moment, when the USSR had already collapsed, Chechnya was, in principle, an independent state. Ingushetia separated from Chechnya, declaring that they wanted to create their own autonomous republic within the Russian Federation. And we, at that time, President Jokhar Dudayev and our government, treated this with understanding, and the separation happened in an absolutely peaceful way. Just like Czechoslovakia, Checheno-Ingushetia also divided. Only Ingushetia joined the Russian Federation, and we remained independent. And for all these 3 years, there was constant anti-Chechen propaganda. We spoke about the fact that already in 2014, when Russia began its provocation here in Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, and the subsequent war in eastern Ukraine, all of this had been laid out back in that period. As far back as 1995, Jokhar Dudayev warned the world. And today it is not only Ukraine that suffers aggression, and Russia is a threat not only to Ukraine but to the entire civilized world. Back then, in 1995, Jokhar warned that if Russia were not stopped there in Chechnya, it would go on representing a threat, and that the whole world would eventually have to face this evil.
Ichkeria had slightly reduced its appetite, but had not stopped. In Crimea, there would still be bloodshed. Ukraine would still clash with Russia, irreconcilably. As long as Russism exists, it will never abandon its ambitions.
This is exactly what we have today, and therefore, of course, we, as the legitimate leadership of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, directly link our future and our liberation from Russian yoke, the deoccupation of our country, to what is happening here. Likewise, other peoples of the Caucasus, who today are in colonial dependence, directly understand and realize that their fate is also being decided here in Ukraine. Only a military defeat of Russia in Ukraine can allow these peoples to become free and independent. Therefore, on the 24th, the war began, the first act of aggression in 2022. On the 25th, at the meeting of the State Committee for the Deoccupation of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, we issued an appeal both to the peoples of the North Caucasus and to Chechens everywhere that today we must support Ukraine and form units that will repel Russian aggression together with Ukrainians.
Brothers, Ukrainians, the Chechen people are with you, and I am sure that together we will defend the freedom of Ukraine, protect our country, and we will defeat these barbarians. Glory to Ukraine.
And from that moment, our work here in Ukraine has continued, and without exaggeration, we directly link the possible changes in the Chechen Republic, in the Caucasus, and even in Russia itself, to the situation in Ukraine.
I remember the footage from that rally. I think it was in Brussels. You, I believe, were in Brussels then, and you gathered a lot of people that day at that rally. And I wanted to ask you, what did you feel when you learned that Putin had launched a full-scale aggression against Ukraine?
Just before this aggression, you remember, for 1.5 to 2 months, there were very serious debates, analytical discussions. Would Putin go or not? Would he start a large-scale war or not? I was one of those who, until the very end, did not believe that Putin would commit this aggression, and I explained why. Because this would mean the end of the Russian Empire, and I did not imagine that Putin and his circle would take such a step. Well, apparently they had different information, and they had a different idea of how it would unfold. Huge resources were allocated, $5 billion, for bribing officials, politicians, the military, security structures, in order for Ukraine to greet Russia almost with flowers. And Putin brought in those troops. The contingent he sent at the beginning was, in fact, not intended to occupy this entire country. That number of troops would have been enough to occupy the Chechen Republic, for example, even though they fought with us for a year and a half. In the first war, they tried to take us in 2 hours, and with Ukraine, in 3 hours, they claimed they would solve the Ukraine issue, with us in 2 hours altogether.
In 3 days, you mean?
Yes, in 3 days, 3 days for Ukraine. And we know for certain that those units that were going into Ukraine were preparing to hold a parade in Kyiv. They already had parade uniforms. Everything was prepared for the parade. But the most important thing here is that the West, in the person of the United States of America, accepted this as a fact. They accepted it, and in conversations with Ukrainian politicians, they already said, well, that's it, guys, we can help you evacuate, move you, but unfortunately it's already a fact that Russia is seizing Ukraine. But when your leadership, the military and political leadership, in the person of President Zelensky, rejected this offer, and the Ukrainian people gave resistance, a very serious resistance. And here's what I also had in mind when Putin did what he did. For 8 years, Russian propaganda had been working to demoralize Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people. And as he called this operation, denazification and demilitarization. That meant the Ukrainian nation as such had to cease to exist. The Ukrainian state had to cease to exist. And in that situation, of course, both the military leadership and the Ukrainian people showed simply a super collective heroism, delivering this powerful resistance, and that is why they were forced to pull back at first, in order to regroup for the long term, as they are now doing, mobilizing and waging this war. But what was happening then, for me it was obvious, was the beginning of the end of the Russian Empire. And today, for the international community, not to mention Ukraine, there is no other solution or other way out of the current situation except Russia's military defeat. The European Union has none. If today the European Union allows Russia to win this war, then they will be next, step by step, country after country. They will start from those territories they considered historically theirs. These are the Baltic states, Poland and Finland. Why did Finland, which had maintained neutrality, immediately join NATO after this? And the same with Sweden. Therefore, what is happening here today, in principle, is what we stated 3 to 4 years ago when the war began. It is actually being confirmed. Whatever one's attitude toward the processes taking place inside Russia today, Russia is heading toward its logical end as an empire, and the European Union has no other choice but to bring this to a conclusion in precisely this way. And therefore, I am sure that Ukraine will be supported until the end. Ukraine will win this war, and Ukraine's victory will mean the end of the Russian Empire and the decolonization of the peoples who are today in colonial dependence on Russia.
Ahmed Kadyrov, in this program we mainly talk about the future, about the strategy of freedom. We look ahead and try to understand how to make the peoples now conquered by Russia become free. So if we talk about Chechnya, how does the Republic live today under this puppet authority established from Moscow in the person of a Kadyrov? What is the situation in the Republic now?
The fact is that what is happening in Chechnya today is a very telling example for Ukraine. The longer the occupation of Ukrainian territories lasts, the harder it will be in the future to influence the situation. The mentality changes, people change, the system itself and the situation they have found themselves in, it does not allow them to try to change the existing format. To change this format in the current situation, there must be some support from outside. It has always been this way, and Chechnya is no exception. This is probably the history of world wars. There is no analog to how much a small nation on a small territory resisted Russian aggressors. The war began in 1994. I do not separate them into the First and Second Wars. It was just a pause. The Russians needed to take a time out, regroup, and create an informational basis to continue Russian aggression and the occupation of the territory, both economically and militarily. Those 2 to 3 years, when we thought we had concluded peace with Russia, Russia was preparing for a new, large-scale, already open military campaign. And therefore, from 1994, Russia officially declared that it had ended the war and subdued Chechnya in 2010, from 1994 to 2010. But the last unit of Chechen resistance fighters was eliminated, killed, in 2021. Just imagine, throughout this whole period, 300,000 civilians died as a result of this war, including 42,000 children. The territory is now 14,500 square kilometers, according to new realities. And throughout all these years, the Chechen people resisted. In fact, what is happening today, despite the glass skyscrapers and the city being rebuilt, is all a facade behind which there is suffering, and the people have simply resigned themselves to their fate. They are not truly subdued, I know this. We have a very serious underground in Chechnya, but today the situation in Chechnya can be seen as a concentration camp where the entire people are hostages. There are those who serve this power, and on TV, propaganda uses precisely those who today serve these occupation structures. The rest of the population, which is waiting for a certain hour, is unseen and unnoticed. People are simply surviving and trying to survive in this situation. Therefore, when we say that our future, our liberation, and de-occupation are directly linked to Ukraine, we proceed from the realities that exist today in Russia itself, in the Chechen Republic, and in Ukraine. Here in Ukraine today, the Chechen army is being revived. We have restored the Ministry of Defense and 5 to 6 units that are now in the Foreign Legion and as volunteers. They are gaining enormous experience in modern warfare here. And in fact, what is happening in Ukraine today, the war in Ukraine, there is no analog to this war either. It is a completely different war. And the world is now observing how new technologies have changed the entire understanding of warfare and the front line. Now the front line is the entire territory. One cannot say anymore that here is the front line and the rest is either occupied or safe. That does not exist because the whole territory is now exposed and is the front line. And so what Putin is organizing today with these massive attacks on peaceful cities is terrorism, open terrorism, an attempt to intimidate the population, to break the spirit of these people and subdue it. And they did not succeed in Chechnya, despite all those years of occupation, and I'm sure they will not succeed in Ukraine.
On February 24th, 2022, when you made your statement in Brussels, Chechen volunteers also made a statement, the ones you mentioned. Many of them are now fighting in Ukraine, defending Ukraine and the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Could you tell us a little more about those battalions, those units that are now fighting in Ukraine? And am I correct in understanding that this is precisely the force you're counting on in the future as the main force that could bring the long-awaited freedom and independence to your homeland?
On the 25th, I made a statement that we were announcing the recruitment of Chechen volunteers for Ukraine. On the 27th to 28th, President of Ukraine Zelensky signed a decree on the creation of the Foreign Legion. About a month and a half to 2 months later, one of our departments of the Ministry of Defense signed an agreement with one of the departments of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine on cooperation and joint operations. And from that moment, the process of restoring the armed forces of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria began. We restored the Ministry of Defense and began forming units. Today there are 5 to 6 units in the Foreign Legion, plus 2 units that are not part of any structure and have the status of volunteer detachments. All of them are engaged in combat operations alongside Ukrainians, both volunteers and our units. Our units are directly linked to the command of the Foreign Legion, while the volunteers are in various Ukrainian structures, part of the security forces, and are on the front lines with them. And the most important point, yes, absolutely, what I said earlier, we are reviving the Chechen army, and it is being revived in Ukraine. This is precisely the core we are counting on when the time comes for us to act in our homeland. This is the core we will use. You know that during World War I, the Polish Legion was created, an international Polish Legion, and this legion played the key role in liberating Poland and creating a sovereign independent state. The same way today, these fighters here are the core, the force around which the Chechen people will unite to change the existing system of power. I'm absolutely sure of this, and this is the goal we are working toward, both here and in the Chechen Republic.
What will happen to Kadyrov's government after Chechnya becomes independent?
Those guilty of the Chechen tragedy will be held accountable, of course, but mostly, as I said, all those structures that were forced to remain in the Republic will be amnestied. Our main task is to prevent civil war, and there will be none, although today's so-called good Russians keep threatening and convincing the West that as soon as Russia leaves the Caucasus, interethnic wars, tragedy and chaos will begin. Nothing of the sort. We see today, and this is notable, I think the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. Yes, in Georgia processes are still underway. Putin is clinging to Georgia. But in any case, Georgia is already free. It will never again be the kind of state Putin or Russians are used to seeing. The Caucasus is being liberated. The Caucasus was artificially divided into the South Caucasus and the North Caucasus, because the southern countries of the so-called South Caucasus were conquered earlier by the Russian Empire. The North Caucasus, Abkhazia, Circassia, Chechen Ingushetia continued to wage war, and that is why the Russians back then divided the Caucasus into South and North. The Caucasus is a single organism, and I am sure that, by the way, the Second Congress of the Confederation of the Peoples of the Caucasus was held in Kyiv in 2023. On the basis of that conference, we created a committee for the restoration of Caucasian states. This happened in Europe, in Brussels, in the European Parliament, and this committee exists. I am sure that in the future, when these peoples and other republics become sovereign and independent, just like the Chechen Republic, we can create, by analogy with the European Union, a confederative Caucasian Union. And this will work. It will be of interest to the West, to the East, to everyone.
Ahmed Kadyrov, a few words about your foreign policy and the future of your international strategy. I think for both our states, this is a crucial topic. Looking back at Russia's aggression against Chechnya, it seems to me that at the time, what your state lacked most was international support. I know you have an active Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as consuls and representatives in various countries. Tell us more about your work in this international sphere. Perhaps there are already preliminary agreements on cooperation with governments or countries.
Of course, I would gladly share all the detail if only our friends were listening, but since our enemies are also listening, I'll limit myself to the essentials. You're absolutely right in what you've emphasized. And in fact, today I'll be holding a meeting of the Military Council. I've gathered and invited our commanders from different locations. They'll arrive today, and at 4 p.m. we will meet. One of the issues we'll be discussing will be exactly this matter. Our problem back then, and still today, is that we have no backing from international institutions. For us, the most important task in the de-occupation process is to form an international protectorate for a period of 5 to 10 years. What this will look like in practice is a matter of working details, but the key is that it must be established. And I'll say this openly, at the head of such a protectorate we see, and we want to see, Ukraine, around which several dozen countries are united today. If we succeed in creating an international coalition, call it a coalition or an international protectorate, of 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 states, we can in 5 years restore and establish all the necessary structures, creating the conditions for a functioning independent state. This could also become an example for other republics and other regions. For the West, the Caucasus means a new market, new opportunities, and a new territory. If the Chechen Republic alone once held little interest for Western countries, and that's why we were betrayed in 1994. The whole Caucasus is a different matter entirely. Naturally, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as myself, are working in this direction so that, as the decisive moment approaches, we are ready. The closer the resolution, the more urgent this becomes. I believe we will succeed.
And continuing our conversation about the future of an independent Chechnya, let's talk a bit about culture, history, and language. The Republic and its people are carriers of an ancient, rich, and beautiful culture. But we see the Kremlin's policy toward native languages and history, rewriting and distorting them. Do you have a strategy or future policy for restoring culture, truthful history, and the Chechen language? From what I understand, your language is not in as dire a state as in some other national republics.
Strangely enough, just yesterday I had a dream about the language. Yes, we are actively thinking about this. Right now, the situation is such that we still have fluent native speakers. That's why I don't see an existential threat, and there's no danger of the language disappearing. These speakers are inside the Republic. I won't name them, but I know them. I listen to them on social media. I know how they work and prepare. Our officials who are in the territory also work in this direction. The decommunization of the Chechen Republic went quite well. Dekadyrovization and deputinization will be even less painful for Chechens when the time comes. And we are preparing for that moment in all spheres. As for culture and language, we have specialists, including in Europe, who work in these fields. So I have no special concern in that regard.
In closing, I always offer my guests, and you are no exception, the opportunity to briefly address those who will see us inside Russia, and in your case, in Chechnya. If you wish to say something or make an appeal, here's your chance.
Thank you. I speak often, but I think it won't hurt to say this again, especially to Russians who today are brainwashed by Putin's propaganda. What the Russian army is doing in Ukraine today is something for which, one day, a Russian person will feel shame. Shame for themselves, shame as a representative of Russian society or Russian identity. I remember Alexander Litvinenko, and I think many do. He was a former officer in the KGB, FSB, and FSK, poisoned in London with polonium-210, and, essentially, murdered on Putin's orders. During the First Chechen War, Litvinenko fought against us. Once they captured a young Chechen, a 16-year-old boy, and Litvinenko interrogated him. He asked, "Why are you here with these bandits? You should be in school." The boy replied, "My whole class went to war, so I went too." From that moment, Litvinenko's attitude changed. Later he told me, "Do you know why I stand with the Chechens now? So that I won't be ashamed in front of my son for what Russians did and are doing in Chechnya. The same applies to all Russians today. You will feel shame if you do not come to your senses and stop the ongoing killing of Ukrainians, children, women, the elderly. You must do everything possible to stop your criminal government, which promotes war and leads your country and you personally to catastrophe. I assure you, Russia can only become a free, independent, law-based state by abandoning imperial ambitions, granting colonized peoples their right to live freely, and ending the wars you ignite around the world. Only then will you have a future. Only then will your children be safe. I am confident the Ukrainian people will withstand this onslaught. They will defend their freedom and independence. Today, truth is on their side, law is on their side, and God is on their side. Together, we will defend the freedom and independence of Ukraine, and we will deoccupy our own country.
Колонизированным народом и прекращайте войны, которые вы сегодня развязываете по всему миру.